Good morning, sweetheart.
Oh, good morning. What's all this?
I thought you'd appreciate a nice start to the day. Want some coffee? I wouldn't ask unless I was sure.
I know. We'll figure this out together. I think there's been a mistake here. What is it, dear? This can't be right.
Please sign the papers, dear. No.
The morning my husband asked me to sign away my future, he made me pancakes. Richard almost never cooked breakfast. So when I walked into the kitchen and saw fresh coffee, warm maple syrup, and a neat stack of legal papers beside my plate, I actually smiled. "Just a few retirement updates," he said, sliding a pen toward me. "Sign them before breakfast so we can forget about paperwork." After 41 years of marriage, I almost did. Then one sentence buried deep in the fine print caught my eye, and suddenly the man sitting across from me felt like someone I had never truly known. If you've ever discovered that trust can disappear in a single moment, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this journey speaks to you, please like and subscribe so we can continue sharing these stories together. Before you go on, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. People often say that trust is built one day at a time. Looking back now, I think that's true. But what they don't tell you is that trust can also blind you one day at a time. By the morning, Richard placed those papers beside my coffee. We had been married for 41 years. 41 birthdays. 41 Christmas mornings. 41 anniversaries. Together we had buried our parents, celebrated the births of our children, welcomed our first gray hairs, and survived more hardships than I ever imagined possible. If someone had asked me the day before whether I trusted my husband, I wouldn't have hesitated. Completely, without question. That answer haunted me later. When Richard and I married, we were both in our early 20s with almost nothing to our names. He had just accepted his first job as a junior financial advisor in Nashville. I had been hired as a third-grade teacher in Franklin, Tennessee. We rented a tiny duplex with thin walls, mismatched furniture, and a kitchen so small that only one person could stand inside at a time. Those were difficult years, but they were happy ones. Richard always loved numbers. He balanced our checkbook every Friday evening with almost religious discipline, while other couples argued about bills. Richard would spread receipts across the dining room table, sharpen two pencils, and quietly organize every expense into neat columns. I admired that about him. Math had never been my strength. Children were. I understood frightened 8-year-olds better than spreadsheets. So, somewhere along the way, without either of us ever discussing it, we divided our marriage into responsibilities. I handled people. Richard handled money. It worked. At least I believed it did. Over the years, his career flourished. He became one of the most respected financial advisors in Williamson County. Clients trusted him with retirement plans, college funds, investment portfolios, and estate strategies. People often stopped us at church or the grocery store just to thank him for helping them prepare for their future. I remember feeling proud. "My husband helps families feel secure," I used to tell people. I never imagined I might someday become one of the people who needed protection from him. Our daughter, Emily, inherited my heart. She became a pediatric nurse, always gentle, always patient. Even as a little girl, she hated seeing anyone in pain. She still called every Sunday evening, never forgetting birthdays or anniversaries. Our son Michael was different. Even as a teenager, he could negotiate almost anything. He sold baseball cards for twice what he paid. He bought old lawn equipment, repaired it, and resold it before he graduated high school. Richard used to laugh proudly and say, "That boy was born to make deals." Eventually, Michael built a successful career in commercial real estate. Richard admired him immensely. I thought it was simply a father being proud of his son. Now I wonder how long their conversations had included subjects I was never meant to hear. Our life looked comfortable from the outside. We owned a beautiful brick home on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Richard insisted on keeping the lawn perfectly trimmed every Saturday morning. I filled the flower beds with hydrangeas and roses that bloomed from spring until early autumn. Neighbors often joked that our house belonged on a postcard. Inside, family photographs covered nearly every wall. Emily's nursing school graduation, Michael receiving his business award, our grandchildren opening Christmas presents. 40 years of smiles frozen inside wooden frames. Sometimes visitors would pause in our hallway and say, "You two have built a wonderful life." I always answered the same way. We've been blessed. Maybe we had. Or maybe blessings require more honesty than I realized. About 7 years earlier, everything changed when I found a lump during an ordinary shower. The diagnosis came quickly: breast cancer. Even now, saying those words silently makes my stomach tighten. The months that followed blurred together into surgeries, treatments, medications, endless appointments, and fear. I tried desperately to hide from my children. Richard never missed a single chemotherapy appointment. He sat beside me in waiting rooms. He held my hand when I was too exhausted to speak. When my hair began falling out, he shaved his own head without telling me beforehand. I cried harder that afternoon than I had after hearing the diagnosis. I thought it was because I loved him so much. Maybe it was. Maybe that part had always been real. During those months, I signed dozens of documents: insurance forms, medical authorizations, bank paperwork, tax extensions, power of attorney forms in case my condition worsened. Richard handled every piece of paper. He would gently place documents in front of me and quietly explain, "It's just another hospital requirement," or "The insurance company needs this." I never questioned him, not once. Why would I? He was taking care of me while I was too frightened to think clearly. That experience changed something permanent inside our marriage. After I recovered, I never looked closely at financial paperwork again. Whenever a document appeared, I simply signed where Richard placed the yellow sticky note. It became our routine, our habit, our unspoken agreement. Trust became automatic. Perhaps that was my greatest mistake. The morning after I refused to sign those breakfast papers, I waited until Richard left for his weekly golf game. I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the folder he had left behind. The house felt unusually quiet. Even the ticking clock sounded louder than normal. I poured another cup of coffee, sat at the dining room table, and opened the folder again. This time I forced myself to read every single page. Not skim. Read. Slowly. Every paragraph. Every definition. Every footnote. The legal language was dense enough to make my eyes ache, but years of teaching children had taught me patience. When something didn't make sense, I read it again, then again. Most of the documents sounded harmless: retirement planning, asset management, long-term financial protection. Exactly the kinds of phrases Richard had used for decades. Then I reached a section with a bold heading: Irrevocable Family Trust. I frowned. Why would something be irrevocable? That word alone unsettled me. I kept reading. The paragraphs became increasingly technical. Trustee, successor trustee, distribution authority, beneficiary rights. None of it sounded familiar. I turned another page, then another. Finally, halfway down one page, I found a sentence that made my hands stop moving. The trust would become effective immediately upon execution. My eyes moved to the next paragraph. The trustee would have exclusive authority to manage, refinance, transfer, mortgage, or sell trust assets. Exclusive authority. Not shared. Not mutual. Exclusive. I swallowed slowly. Richard had told me these were routine retirement papers. Nothing about this felt routine anymore. I flipped back to the first page and noticed something I had somehow overlooked before. The trust already had a name: the Gomez Family Legacy Trust. How could there already be a trust with our family's name on it? Who created it? When? Why had I never heard those words before yesterday morning? For the first time in 41 years of marriage, I realized I didn't actually know what my husband had been doing with our finances, and that frightened me far more than anything written in the fine print. I barely slept that night. Richard lay beside me, breathing peacefully as if nothing had changed. Every so often he rolled onto his side, pulled the blanket closer, and sighed in his sleep. I stared at the ceiling, wondering whether the man beside me was the same husband who had held my hand through chemotherapy, or someone who had simply become very good at playing that role. Around 3 in the morning, I quietly slipped out of bed and walked downstairs. The folder was still where I had left it on the dining room table. I opened it again, hoping that somehow I had misunderstood the legal language. Instead, the words looked even more frightening in the silence of the night. Irrevocable. Exclusive authority. Sole trustee. No matter how many times I read those phrases, they never became less alarming. By sunrise, I had reached one conclusion. I needed someone who wasn't emotionally involved to explain exactly what those papers meant. Not Richard, a professional. After Richard left for his office later that morning, I searched online for estate planning attorneys in Franklin. One name appeared repeatedly with outstanding reviews. Victoria Reynolds. Her office specialized in trusts, wills, retirement planning, and elder financial protection. The words elder financial protection caught my attention immediately. I called before I could lose my nerve. The receptionist spoke kindly. "We had a cancellation this afternoon at 2 o'clock if that works." "Yes," I answered almost too quickly. "I'll take it." The hours before my appointment felt strangely unreal. I cleaned the kitchen, watered my flowers, folded laundry that didn't need folding, anything to keep my hands occupied. Every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the driveway, half afraid Richard had forgotten something and would return unexpectedly. When it was finally time to leave, I placed the folder inside a plain canvas tote instead of carrying it openly. It felt ridiculous. I wasn't committing a crime. Yet somehow, I felt guilty for asking questions about my own financial future. Victoria Reynolds' office occupied the second floor of a renovated brick building overlooking Franklin's historic downtown square. The waiting room felt warm instead of intimidating. Bookshelves lined one wall. Large windows overlooked Main Street. Framed photographs of Tennessee landscapes replaced the cold artwork I usually associated with law offices. When Victoria greeted me, she looked younger than I expected, maybe 35, confident without appearing rushed. She shook my hand firmly. "Mrs. Gomez." "Please," I said softly. "Call me Scarlett." She smiled. "Then I'm Victoria." Something about that simple introduction eased my nerves. Inside her office, she waited until we were seated before asking a single question. "What brings you here today?" I hesitated. How could I possibly summarize 41 years of marriage in one sentence? Finally, I opened the folder. "My husband asked me to sign these yesterday morning." Victoria nodded. "And you decided not to." I noticed one sentence that didn't feel right. She leaned forward slightly. "What made you pause?" "I honestly don't know." I laughed nervously. Maybe after 41 years, my instincts finally decided to wake up. Victoria smiled politely before opening the folder. Then she began reading. Unlike me, she moved with remarkable precision. She wasn't reading every word. She was hunting. Every few pages, she marked something with a small yellow tab. Sometimes she underlined a paragraph. Other times, she simply nodded to herself without saying anything. Nearly 20 minutes passed in complete silence. The only sounds were turning pages and the occasional clicking of her pen. The longer she remained quiet, the faster my heart beat. Finally, she placed the papers neatly on her desk. "Scarlett," she chose her next words carefully. "These are definitely not routine retirement updates." I felt my stomach tighten. I knew something wasn't right. "You were correct to wait." She turned one page toward me. "This document creates what's called an irrevocable family trust." I gathered that much. "But I don't understand why that's a problem." Victoria folded her hands. "An irrevocable trust isn't automatically bad. Many families use them for legitimate estate planning, tax strategies, or asset protection." She paused. "The concern isn't that a trust exists. The concern is how this particular trust is structured." She pointed to another paragraph. "According to these terms, once you sign, nearly every major marital asset becomes property of the trust. Our home, yes. Our retirement savings, yes. The lake cabin, yes. Our investment accounts, Those as well. I stared at her. But Richard told me these were simply retirement documents. They involve retirement, she spoke gently. But they do much more than that. My voice sounded strangely distant. What happens after everything enters the trust? Victoria turned another page. Richard becomes the sole trustee. I don't know what that really means. It means he controls the trust. I thought we already shared everything. You currently do. She looked directly into my eyes. After signing this, that balance changes dramatically, she continued. The trustee has authority to buy, refinance, transfer, lease, mortgage, or even sell trust assets according to the trust agreement. Without asking me, Victoria nodded slowly. Under these terms, yes. I felt the room tilt slightly. But my name is on our house. For now. She let those two words settle. After execution, legal ownership changes. What about me? You become a beneficiary. I frowned. That sounds important. It sounds important because it usually is, she sighed. But beneficiaries and trustees are not the same thing. Explain it to me like I'm one of my third graders. Victoria smiled sadly. Imagine someone gives you permission to live in a house. All right. But someone else owns the keys. They decide whether repairs happen. They decide whether the house is sold. They decide how money is spent. You still benefit from living there, but you no longer control it. The simplicity of her explanation hit me harder than any legal language. So I wouldn't truly own my own home anymore. Not in the same way. What if Richard died? Victoria flipped another page. According to these documents, she stopped reading for a second. Michael Gomez becomes successor trustee. My son. Yes. I blinked several times. So Michael would control everything. He would control the trust. I whispered almost to myself. Emily isn't mentioned. Victoria continued searching. Another minute passed, then another. Finally, she looked up. I've located one distribution provision for your daughter. One, yes. She appears to receive a fixed inheritance only after both you and Richard pass away. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our daughter has always treated us equally. I understand. But this document does not. Silence filled the office. I thought about Emily calling every Sunday, driving me to doctor's appointments, bringing homemade soup after surgery, never asking for money, never expecting anything. Why would Richard structure things this way? It made no sense. Unless this wasn't really about fairness. Victoria interrupted my thoughts. Scarlett, there is something else. My hands tightened around the arms of the chair. What now? She reached for the last section of the file. I almost missed it. She slid the page across her desk. This trust references preliminary transfer documents. I don't understand. It indicates that certain preparatory filings have already been completed. When? She pointed to a date. My eyes widened, almost 8 months earlier. But I never signed anything. Victoria slowly nodded. That's exactly why this concerns me. She opened another attachment clipped behind the trust agreement. There, partially hidden beneath several pages, was a signature acknowledgement form. My name appeared beneath the typed line, Scarlett Ann Gomez. But the signature space was blank. Victoria looked at me carefully. Do you remember ever meeting with an attorney about this trust? No. Do you remember authorizing anyone to prepare these documents? No. Did Richard ever mention creating a family trust? Never. She closed the folder. I can't tell you exactly what happened. Not yet. But I can tell you this. These papers did not appear overnight. They've been in preparation for quite some time. I felt as though 41 years of certainty had collapsed into a single afternoon. Richard hadn't made a sudden decision over breakfast. This had been planned, carefully, patiently, perhaps for months, perhaps longer. As I stood to leave, Victoria handed the folder back to me. Don't sign anything. I won't. And don't confront Richard yet. I stopped. Why? Because right now he believes you know nothing. She held my gaze. Sometimes the person who thinks they're holding all the cards is the easiest person to prove wrong. Walking back to my car, I looked at the folder resting against my side. When I'd arrived that afternoon, I thought I was carrying retirement paperwork. Now it felt as though I was carrying evidence. Evidence that someone I had loved for more than 4 decades had been quietly building a future that no longer included me as an equal. And I had the terrifying feeling that I had only uncovered the first layer of the truth. When I pulled into our driveway that afternoon, Richard's SUV was already parked in the garage. For a brief moment, panic washed over me. Had he come home early? Had someone seen me entering Victoria Reynolds' office? I sat in my car with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The canvas tote containing the trust documents rested on the passenger seat. Suddenly it felt as heavy as a suitcase filled with stones. I took one slow breath, then another. Act normal, I whispered to myself. If he doesn't know you know, don't let him know. Those were Victoria's last words before I left her office. They echoed in my mind as I stepped inside the house. Richard was standing at the kitchen island slicing tomatoes. "There you are," he said with an easy smile. "I was beginning to wonder where you'd gone." His voice sounded exactly the same. Warm, comfortable, familiar. For 41 years, that voice had made me feel safe. Now I found myself studying every expression on his face, searching for signs that I had somehow missed all these years. "I stopped by the bookstore," I lied. "I wanted a new novel." He nodded without hesitation. "Find anything good?" "I think so. I'll probably start it tonight." He smiled again. "Good. You've earned a relaxing evening." Relaxing. The word almost made me laugh. Instead, I forced a smile and began unloading groceries I hadn't actually planned to buy. On the drive home, I'd stopped at a supermarket simply so I wouldn't return empty-handed. It suddenly occurred to me that I had never lied to Richard before. Not once. Yet the first lie I'd ever told my husband felt necessary. That realization hurt more than I expected. Dinner passed almost normally. Richard talked about golf, a neighbor's new roof, the church fundraiser next month. Everything except the documents. He didn't ask whether I'd read them. He didn't ask whether I had signed them. That surprised me. If those papers were truly as important as Victoria believed, why wasn't he pressing me? Unless he already assumed I would. After dinner, Richard disappeared into his home office to answer emails. I remained in the living room pretending to watch television. My attention never left the hallway leading to his office. For years, I had respected one simple boundary in our marriage. His office was his space. Mine was the sewing room upstairs. We never searched through each other's belongings. Trust had made privacy effortless. Now privacy suddenly looked different. Now it looked like opportunity. Around 8:30, Richard announced he was going upstairs to shower before bed. The moment I heard the bathroom door close, my heart began racing. I counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. By 60, I stood. Every step toward his office felt strangely loud, despite the carpet beneath my feet. I paused at the doorway. His desk sat exactly as always, perfectly organized, pens aligned, computer centered, file trays stacked neatly. The room reflected the man everyone admired: disciplined, reliable, professional. I told myself I wasn't snooping. I was searching for answers. There was a difference. At least I hoped there was. The top desk drawers contained nothing unusual. Pens, business cards, old reading glasses, golf scorecards. The filing cabinet beside the window held tax folders, investment reports, and insurance paperwork arranged alphabetically. Richard had always been meticulous, almost too meticulous. I began comparing folder labels with the documents Victoria had shown me. Something immediately felt wrong. The property folder for our lake cabin looked unusually thin. I opened it. Inside were only recent property tax receipts. No deed, no purchase documents, no mortgage records. Those papers had always been there. I knew because years earlier I'd helped Richard organize them after we refinanced. Where had they gone? I checked another folder. Our primary residence. Again. Property tax statements, insurance renewals, No original deed. A cold chill crept down my spine. One missing document might have been accidental. Two wasn't. I carefully returned everything exactly as I'd found it. Then I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. A small fireproof lockbox sat beneath Richard's desk. It wasn't new. I had probably walked past it hundreds of times. Until that evening, I had simply assumed it contained client records. Now I wasn't so sure. I knelt beside it. Locked. Of course. Before I could think further, footsteps creaked overhead. I quickly stood and straightened a stack of papers on his desk, just as if I'd entered to borrow a pen. Seconds later, Richard walked into the hallway, drying his hair with a towel. "What are you doing?" The question came so suddenly that my pulse jumped. I held up the pen. I couldn't find one upstairs. He looked at me for only a second. Then he smiled. "You know where everything is better than I do." The irony nearly took my breath away. If only that were still true. Later that night, after Richard fell asleep, I quietly opened the notebook I normally used for grocery lists. On the first blank page, I wrote 3 words: things that changed. Below it, I began making a list: missing deed for house, missing lake cabin documents, locked fireproof box, irrevocable trust, Michael listed as successor trustee, unknown preliminary filings. Victoria had advised me to document everything, no matter how small, because memory fades. Paper doesn't. The following morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I visited the attic. The space smelled faintly of cedar and old cardboard. Plastic storage bins lined one wall. Christmas decorations. Emily's childhood school projects. Boxes labeled Taxes 2004. Taxes 2005. House records. That last label caught my attention immediately. I pulled the heavy container toward me. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders dating back nearly 30 years. Richard must have forgotten these older records existed. I spent almost 2 hours sorting through them. Most contained exactly what I expected: old mortgage statements, home insurance renewals, closing documents from when we first purchased the house. Then I found a yellow envelope tucked between 2 folders. Across the front in Richard's handwriting were the words, "Original property documents." My hands trembled as I opened it. The deed to our home was gone. The original survey was gone. The title insurance policy was gone. Only photocopies remained. Someone had deliberately removed every original document. I sat back against a dusty storage box. Why original deeds don't simply disappear. People don't accidentally remove only the most important papers. Someone had selected them. Carefully. Intentionally. As I continued searching, another discovery stopped me cold. Inside the folder labeled Lake Cabin was a handwritten inventory Richard had made years earlier. Every document was listed: purchase contract, warranty deed, county survey, boat dock permit, insurance rider. Beside each item, Richard had once written the word "filed." Someone had crossed out 3 entries with black ink. No explanation, no date, nothing. I immediately took photographs using my phone. Every page, every note, every crossed out line. When I finally climbed downstairs, my phone rang. Emily. "Hi, Mom." Her cheerful voice almost made me cry. "Hi, sweetheart. You sound tired." "I didn't sleep very well." "You and Dad doing okay?" The question caught me off guard. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know." She hesitated. "Dad seemed distracted lately. He forgot to call Lily on her birthday." Dad never forgets birthdays. I hadn't realized that. Richard prided himself on remembering every family milestone. Maybe his attention had been somewhere else entirely. "I'm sure he's just busy," I answered carefully. Emily didn't sound convinced. "If you need anything, you know you can tell me." "I know. And I love you." "I love you too." After we hung up, I stared out the kitchen window. For the first time, I wondered how much I should tell her. Not yet. Victoria had advised patience. Evidence first, confrontation later. That afternoon, I drove to the Williamson County Register of Deeds office. The courthouse stood only 15 minutes from our home, yet I had never needed to visit before. Inside, a clerk directed me toward the public records terminal. If you know the owner's name, she explained, you can search property history yourself. I typed slowly. Richard Gomez, Scarlett Gomez. Our home appeared immediately. Then the lake cabin. I clicked on the cabin first. Several familiar filings appeared. Purchase records, tax assessments, boundary surveys. Then one unfamiliar entry dated only 6 months earlier. Property transfer affidavit. Transfer. My heart skipped. I opened the digital record. The first page loaded, then the second. Halfway through the document, one line froze me in place. Transfer to the Gomez Family Legacy Trust. Exactly the same name printed on the papers Richard had placed beside my breakfast. I hadn't imagined any of it. The trust wasn't merely a proposal, it already existed. And somehow, one of our most valuable properties had already been moved into it. I stared at the computer screen, unable to look away. The questions were multiplying much faster than the answers. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't simply about convincing me to sign. Richard had already begun changing our future long before that quiet breakfast ever happened. I left the county records office with more questions than answers. The afternoon sun was bright enough to make me squint as I crossed the parking lot, but I barely noticed the heat. My mind kept replaying the words I'd seen on the computer screen. Transfer to the Gomez Family Legacy Trust. Victoria had suspected the trust already existed. Now I had proof. Richard hadn't been asking for my permission to begin his plan. He had been asking for my signature to finish it. I sat inside my car for several minutes before starting the engine. Instinct told me to drive straight back to Victoria's office. Instead, I took photographs of every page I'd printed from the public records terminal and emailed copies to myself. Then I saved duplicate copies to a cloud storage account Richard didn't know existed. If the past week had taught me anything, it was this: never assume important documents will still be there tomorrow. As I pulled into our neighborhood, I noticed a familiar black SUV parked outside our house. Michael's. It was only a little after 3 in the afternoon. That immediately struck me as unusual. My son rarely visited during the work week without calling first. Commercial real estate kept him busy from morning until evening. If he came over unexpectedly, there was usually a reason. I parked at the curb instead of the driveway. The front door wasn't fully closed. It stood open just enough for voices to drift outside. Neither Richard nor Michael realized I had arrived. I quietly stepped onto the porch. "She'll sign eventually," Michael was saying. His voice carried clearly through the narrow opening. Richard answered more softly. "I thought she would have signed the first morning." "Mom trusts you." "I know." There was a pause. Then Michael laughed lightly. "She always has." Something inside me tightened. Richard sighed. "She's been asking more questions lately." "About what?" "The paperwork." Michael didn't sound worried. "Just tell her it's standard estate planning." "I already did." Another silence. Then Michael spoke again. "Well, either way, we need everything completed before the end of the quarter." My heart began pounding so loudly I was certain they would hear it. End of the quarter. There was a deadline. This wasn't simply about organizing retirement paperwork. There was urgency behind it. Richard lowered his voice so much that I couldn't make out every word. I caught only fragments. Bank. Tax advantages. Once the signature. Can't reverse. I leaned slightly closer. The porch floor creaked beneath my foot. Instantly, the conversation stopped. Every sound inside the house disappeared. I quickly stepped backward, pretending I had just arrived. A second later, Richard opened the front door with his familiar smile. "Scarlett, there you are. I didn't hear your car." "I stopped at the pharmacy." Another lie. I was beginning to hate how naturally they came. Michael walked into the foyer carrying 2 coffee mugs. "Hi, Mom." He kissed my cheek. His smile looked perfectly genuine. If I hadn't overheard the conversation moments earlier, I never would have questioned it. "Working from here today?" I asked casually. Michael shrugged. "Dad wanted to run a few ideas past me." "What kind of ideas?" Neither man answered immediately. Richard spoke first. Investment strategies. Michael nodded almost too quickly. Commercial properties. The explanation sounded rehearsed. For years I would have accepted it without another thought. Now I noticed how neither of them actually answered the question. Investment strategies. Commercial properties. General words. No specifics. I carried my grocery bag into the kitchen while they returned to Richard's office. The door closed behind them. I stood quietly beside the sink listening. The walls muffled their voices too much to understand individual words. Still, they remained in that office for nearly 90 minutes, longer than any discussion about golf or real estate. When Michael finally left, he hugged me again. "You look tired, Mom." "I've been busy. You should let Dad handle stressful things." I forced a smile. "Your father has always enjoyed being in charge." Michael laughed. "He certainly has." There was something strange about that sentence. Not what he said, how he said it. Almost as though being in charge had become an inside joke between the two of them. That evening, Richard grilled steaks on the back patio. He seemed unusually cheerful. He even suggested taking a weekend trip to the lake cabin. The suggestion caught me completely off guard. "The cabin? Sure. We haven't been there in months." I looked at him carefully. The cabin that had already been transferred into the trust. The cabin he apparently no longer considered ours. "I'd like that," I answered softly. His smile widened. "Maybe next weekend." I nodded, but inside another question formed. Why invite me there now? Was he simply trying to reassure me? Or was there something at the cabin he wanted me to see, or perhaps not see? The next morning I met Victoria again. She studied the county records I'd printed. "This confirms what we suspected." She laid the papers beside the trust agreement. "The transfer has already been recorded." "But how?" "I never signed anything." Victoria frowned. "That depends. There are several possibilities." She didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, she highlighted one section of the filing. "Notice this. The transfer identified Richard as acting in his capacity as trustee. But according to these trust documents," she tapped another page, "the trust wasn't supposed to become effective until after your signature." I leaned closer. "So how could he already be trustee?" "Exactly." She looked directly at me. "That question concerns me." I felt a chill spread through my chest. "Does that mean something illegal happened?" "I'm not ready to say that. But it certainly means something doesn't fit." Victoria opened another folder. "I also searched the trust registration." "You did?" She nodded. "It identifies one current trustee, Richard Bow, yes, and one successor trustee." I already knew the answer before she spoke. "Michael." She nodded. "He would automatically assume control if Richard became unable to serve." I stared silently at the page. Michael hadn't accidentally become involved. His name had been written into the structure from the beginning. Victoria continued. "Scarlett, I need to ask you something." "Of course." "Has Michael been visiting more frequently lately?" I almost laughed. "He was at our house yesterday. He and Richard spent nearly 2 hours alone in the office." Victoria made a note. "How often has that happened?" I thought back. Once before Easter. Again shortly after Memorial Day. Twice during June. Another visit only last week. Far more often than I'd realized. I never thought much about it. "They're father and son." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." Then she asked another question. "Did Michael ever ask whether you had signed the paperwork?" I remembered the conversation I'd overheard. Not directly, but he assumed I already had. Victoria looked up immediately. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. Until now I hadn't planned to tell her I'd listened outside the front door. Then I realized she needed every detail. So I told her everything. Michael's visit, the partially open door, the conversation, the words I'd heard. "She'll sign eventually. Mom trusts you. We need everything completed before the end of the quarter." Victoria remained completely silent until I finished. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "That's significant." "Why?" "Because Michael wasn't surprised you hadn't signed. He expected you would." I nodded. "Yes." That suggests he already knew exactly what the documents required. The room fell quiet. I stared out the office window at people walking along Main Street, laughing with friends carrying shopping bags, living ordinary lives. I envied them. My entire world now revolved around hidden paperwork, whispered conversations, and legal documents I didn't understand. Victoria interrupted my thoughts. Scarlett, I think we're looking at something much larger than a misunderstanding between spouses. I slowly met her eyes. What do you think we're looking at? She chose her words with extraordinary care. I think your husband didn't create this trust alone. Before I could answer, she turned another page toward me. There, beneath Richard's appointment as trustee, appeared a familiar signature. Not Richard's, not mine. Michael Gomez. His signature wasn't on a future document waiting to become effective. It was already there, signed, dated, witnessed. Months before Richard had ever placed those papers beside my breakfast plate. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could no longer tell myself my son had simply trusted his father. The evidence suggested something far more painful. Michael hadn't just known about the plan, he had become part of it. For the next several days, I stopped looking at my husband as the man I had married. Instead, I began looking at him the way a teacher watches a student taking an important exam. Carefully, patiently, noticing every detail. It amazed me how much I had failed to see before. Richard suddenly became very interested in my schedule. Where are you headed this morning? Running errands. What kind of errands? Oh, nothing exciting. The question sounded casual, friendly, but now I realized he had never cared where I spent a Tuesday morning before. Whenever I returned home, he always asked another question. Everything go well? Not did you enjoy yourself? Not did you find what you needed? Always. Did everything go well? Almost as though he were quietly checking whether his plan remained on track. Fortunately, Victoria had warned me this might happen. People who believe they're controlling a situation often become anxious the moment something changes, she had explained. They begin collecting information. So let him collect harmless information. That became my strategy. If Richard asked where I'd been, I mentioned grocery stores, the library, church volunteers, a garden center. Everything was true, just not the whole truth. The real truth was that Victoria and I had begun rebuilding nearly a year's worth of financial history, one document at a time. Every Tuesday afternoon, I visited her office carrying another folder from our attic. Old tax returns, insurance records, mortgage statements, retirement summaries, canceled checks dating back more than 20 years. Victoria spread everything across a large conference table. At first, the piles looked completely ordinary. By the third meeting, patterns began appearing. They're moving in one direction, she murmured. What is the paperwork? She arranged several folders chronologically. Look, I leaned over the table. The oldest documents list both you and Richard equally. I nodded. Every deed, every account, every investment. She slid several newer documents beside them. Then gradually, she pointed to another page. Language begins changing. Instead of Richard Gomez and Scarlett Gomez joint tenants, the wording slowly shifted toward Richard Gomez trustee, or pending trust assignment. The changes were subtle, easy to overlook. If someone read only one document at a time, they would never notice. But viewed together, the evolution was unmistakable. Richard hadn't transformed our finances overnight. He had been reshaping them piece by piece, like someone quietly replacing bricks beneath a house while pretending the foundation never changed. Victoria made another discovery that afternoon. Scarlett, she held up two nearly identical property summaries. Notice these recording dates. Both involved our lake cabin. Both had been processed through the county office. One filing occurred in March, the other in June. What's unusual? I asked. She rotated the pages toward me. The March filing references supporting documents recorded in April. I stared at her. But April comes after March. Exactly. My teaching instincts immediately understood. The timeline couldn't exist. A document couldn't legally refer to paperwork that hadn't yet been created. Victoria nodded. It's impossible. Unless someone modified records afterward. She didn't answer directly. Let's simply say the sequence deserves much closer examination. The deeper we dug the stranger everything became. Some signatures looked perfectly normal. Others had been electronically inserted. Several forms referenced attachments that no longer appeared anywhere in the county record. One transfer contained an incorrect legal description of the property. Another listed an outdated mailing address Richard hadn't used in years. Each inconsistency alone might have been dismissed as a clerical error. Together, they painted a different picture. Victoria leaned back in her chair. I've practiced estate law for 12 years. I've seen sloppy paperwork. I've seen honest mistakes. This doesn't feel like either. What does it feel like? She hesitated. It feels rushed. The word surprised me. Rushed. Yes. As though someone was trying to complete a complicated process before something happened. What kind of something? I don't know. Retirement. Illness. A business deadline. A tax deadline. But whoever prepared this kept making small mistakes. I remembered the conversation I'd overheard between Richard and Michael. We need everything completed before the end of the quarter. Maybe that deadline mattered more than I realized. One afternoon, while sorting through another box in the attic, I found an old accordion file labeled simply bank statements. Inside were statements going back almost 15 years. Most looked ordinary. Monthly deposits, automatic bill payments, retirement contributions. Then one envelope caught my attention. It had never been opened. The statement inside covered only a single month nearly 11 months earlier. Large withdrawals appeared throughout the month. Attorney consultation, document preparation, recording fees, title research, nearly $6,000 in legal expenses. I frowned. Richard had never mentioned spending that kind of money, especially not on legal services. The payment descriptions were vague, but one line immediately stood out. Reynolds and Carter Legal Services. I blinked. Reynolds, could that be related to Victoria? The next morning I asked her. She laughed softly. No. Completely different firm. She studied the statement. I've heard of Reynolds and Carter. They mostly represent commercial developers. Not estate planning clients. That made even less sense. Then why would Richard hire them? I don't know. But now we have another question. She added the bank statement to our growing evidence file. By then, the folder had become so thick that she'd started using color-coded tabs. Property, banking, trust, timeline, county filings, potential inconsistencies. Watching that evidence file grow gave me an odd combination of hope and sadness. Hope because facts were replacing fear. Sadness because every new document pushed Richard further away from the man I believed I had married. Meanwhile, life inside our home continued almost normally. Richard still kissed my forehead before leaving each morning. Still asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. Still reminded me to wear a jacket when evenings became cool. His kindness hadn't disappeared. That almost made everything harder. Because if he had suddenly become cruel, I could have hated him. Instead, he remained affectionate while quietly trying to convince me to surrender control of our future. One Sunday after church, something unexpected happened. Several couples gathered outside talking before heading home. Our longtime friends Harold and Diane Bennett walked over. Harold and Richard had played golf together for nearly 20 years. Richard, Harold said with a grin. You still owe me a rematch. Richard laughed. You've been saying that since last summer. While the men joked, Diane pulled me aside to admire the flowers planted outside the church. A few moments later, I noticed something unusual. Harold wasn't laughing anymore. He was studying Richard with an expression I couldn't quite identify. Concern. Maybe guilt. When Richard excused himself to greet another church member, Harold looked directly at me, just for a second. Then he quietly said, Scarlett. His voice was unusually serious. When you have some free time. He hesitated. I think we should have coffee. I smiled politely. Of course. Any particular reason? He looked toward Richard, who was still talking nearby, then back at me. There's something I've been meaning to tell you. Before I could ask another question, Diane returned carrying her purse. The conversation ended immediately. Harold simply smiled. Give me a call this week. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. Something I've been meaning to tell you. Why now? Had he discovered something? Had Richard spoken to him? Or had Harold seen pieces of this story long before I ever did? That evening, I wrote another note inside my investigation notebook. Meet Harold. Possible witness, possible information. When I closed the notebook, I noticed how many pages I'd already filled. Names, dates, documents, questions. A month earlier, my biggest concern had been deciding what flowers to plant before autumn. Now I was building a timeline of my own marriage. And somehow I had the growing feeling that the answers no longer rested inside legal documents. They rested inside people, especially the people Richard believed would never speak. I called Harold Bennett the following Tuesday morning. My finger hovered over his name for several seconds before I finally pressed the green button. Part of me hoped he wouldn't answer. Another part desperately wanted him to. The phone rang twice. Harold speaking? It's Scarlett. There was a brief silence. I'm glad you called. His voice carried a quiet relief that immediately caught my attention. I wasn't sure if you would. You said there was something I needed to hear. There is. Another pause. But not over the phone. Can we meet? I know a small cafe on Fifth Avenue. I'll be there in an hour. I'll save you a table. The cafe sat inside a renovated brick building overlooking the town square. It wasn't one Richard and I usually visited. That made me feel slightly safer. When I walked inside, Harold was already seated near the back window, with two untouched cups of coffee waiting on the table. He stood as I approached. For a man in his early 70s, Harold still carried himself with quiet confidence. He had spent more than 35 years as a certified public accountant before retiring, and everything about him reflected patience and precision. Today, however, he looked tired, older than I remembered. There were deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a few months earlier. Thank you for coming, he said softly. I've been thinking about this conversation for a long time. So have I. I sat down across from him. Neither of us reached for the coffee. Finally, I asked the question that had been weighing on me since Sunday. What did you want to tell me? Harold looked out the window for several seconds before answering. First, I'm sorry. The apology surprised me. For what? For staying quiet. My stomach tightened. What exactly did you stay quiet about? He sighed heavily. Richard came to see me nearly 11 months ago. Almost exactly the same time, Victoria believed the trust planning had begun. He asked for advice. What kind of advice? He wanted another opinion before meeting with an attorney. About the trust. Harold nodded slowly. Yes. I swallowed hard. What did he tell you? Harold folded his hands together. He said he was worried. Worried about what? You. I blinked. Me. He said your health had changed after your cancer. He said you had become more forgetful. My eyes widened. I haven't. I know. He claimed you struggled to understand complicated financial matters. I don't. I know. Each answer felt like another stone dropping into my stomach. Harold continued. He said he wanted to simplify everything before either of you became older. That doesn't sound unreasonable. It wouldn't have been. Harold looked directly into my eyes. If that had actually been his intention. I waited. He asked whether placing nearly every marital asset into an irrevocable trust under his sole control would be the safest option. I stared at him. What did you tell him? I told him absolutely not. Harold didn't hesitate. I reminded him that married couples usually build estate plans together. I told him transparency protects families. I even asked why you weren't attending the meeting. What did Richard say? He laughed. Harold's expression darkened. He said, Scarlett trusts me completely. The exact same words Michael had spoken outside our front door. A chill ran through me. Harold continued quietly. I asked again why you weren't involved. He said discussing complicated legal matters only made you anxious. I couldn't help letting out a bitter laugh. 40 years as a teacher. I managed classrooms full of 8-year-olds. But apparently legal paperwork would overwhelm me. Harold nodded sadly. I didn't believe him either. He reached into the leather folder beside his chair. I almost didn't bring this. He placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. I made notes after that meeting. I unfolded the page. Harold's neat handwriting filled both sides. The date matched almost perfectly with the earliest bank statement Victoria and I had found. One sentence had been underlined twice. Client insists spouse need not review documents before signing. Another line read, advised joint consultation. Recommendation rejected. I looked back up. You kept notes. I kept notes on almost every financial conversation during my career. Old habits. I handed the paper back. Victoria will probably want to see this. You may give her a copy. I already made one. Of course he had. For the first time in weeks, I felt as though someone besides Victoria truly understood the seriousness of what was happening. Harold took a sip of coffee before continuing. I thought that would be the end of it. But 3 months later, Richard called again. My pulse quickened. What happened? He sounded frustrated. He said the attorneys were moving too slowly. He wanted stronger language. What kind of language? The kind that gave him more control. I frowned. More control. He specifically asked whether successor authority could automatically transfer to Michael without court involvement. My chest tightened. So Michael was already part of the discussion. Very much so. Harold nodded. In fact, he hesitated. Michael attended part of that second meeting. The room suddenly felt much smaller. I remembered Michael's confident smile, his casual jokes, his reassuring hugs. How many of those moments had happened while he was helping build a legal structure that quietly removed me from my own future? What did Michael say? Harold looked uncomfortable. He didn't say much. But when I questioned whether you had reviewed the proposal, he answered before Richard could. What did he say? Mom doesn't need every detail. I closed my eyes. For a long moment I couldn't speak. When I finally opened them again, Harold was watching me with genuine compassion. I'm sorry. I should have contacted you then. Why didn't you? He lowered his eyes. Because Richard was my friend. I convinced myself he would eventually include you. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. Instead, he sighed, I watched things become worse. I nodded slowly. I probably would have wanted to believe the same thing. Harold leaned forward. But there's something else. The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. Richard wasn't acting entirely on his own. I frowned. I know Michael was involved. I don't just mean involved. Harold chose his next words carefully. I think Michael became the driving force. I stared at him. What makes you say that? Richard originally talked about protecting assets. Michael kept talking about efficiency. He used phrases like future flexibility, business opportunities, faster decision-making. Harold shook his head. They sounded less like family planning and more like investment strategy. Suddenly, another memory returned. Michael had become increasingly interested in commercial development over the past 2 years. Several of his projects required substantial financing. At one family dinner, he had joked that banks never lend enough money to ambitious people. At the time, Richard had laughed. Now those conversations sounded different. Could the trust have been connected to Michael's business ambitions? Harold seemed to read my thoughts. I don't know whether money was the motivation. But I know this. Richard changed after Michael became involved. How? He stopped asking what was fair. He only asked what was legally possible. Those words lingered between us. Fair, possible. They weren't the same thing, not even close. Before we left, Harold reached into his folder one final time. I debated whether to give you this. He handed me a business card. On the back he had written one name. Douglas Mercer. Who's that? The financial consultant Richard eventually hired after he stopped asking for my advice. I've never met him. But if someone understands how this trust was structured, Harold paused. It may be him. I carefully placed the card inside my notebook. As we walked toward the parking lot, Harold stopped beside my car. Scarlett. Yes. I've known Richard for over 20 years. He wasn't always like this. I looked at him. I believe you. But whatever changed him, Harold glanced toward the street before finishing his sentence. It happened long before he placed those papers beside your breakfast. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about one sentence. He stopped asking what was fair. He only asked what was legally possible. Until now, I had believed I was uncovering a secret financial plan. Now I realized I was uncovering something much deeper. Somewhere along the way, my husband had quietly exchanged love for control. And somehow my own son had decided that control was worth protecting. 3 days after meeting, I invited everyone to Sunday dinner. If anyone in my family found the invitation unusual, they didn't mention it. For decades, Sunday dinners had been one of my favorite traditions. Roast chicken, homemade mashed potatoes, fresh green beans from my little garden, apple pie if the grandchildren were coming. This time, however, there was another purpose. I wanted to watch them, not accuse them, not confront them, simply observe. Victoria had encouraged the idea. People often reveal more than they intend during ordinary conversations, she had said. So don't ask legal questions. Ask family questions. By 4 o'clock, the house was filled with familiar sounds. Emily arrived first, carrying a bowl of homemade macaroni and cheese. She hugged me tightly. You look better this week. I've been sleeping a little more. That wasn't entirely true, but she smiled anyway. A few minutes later, Michael walked in carrying a bottle of wine. Richard followed him through the front door after parking his car. Watching the two of them enter together immediately caught my attention. Years ago, they would have arrived separately. Lately, they seemed to coordinate everything. Richard kissed my cheek. Smells wonderful. Michael looked toward the dining table. You've outdone yourself again, Mom. Their voices sounded sincere, almost affectionate. It reminded me how complicated betrayal could be. People imagine betrayal arriving with shouting anger or obvious cruelty. Sometimes it arrives while someone compliments your cooking. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Emily talked about one of her young patients finally going home after weeks in the hospital. Michael described a commercial property his company had recently sold. Richard joked about losing another golf match to Harold. For nearly 30 minutes, everything looked perfectly normal. If a stranger had walked into our dining room, they would have seen an ordinary American family enjoying Sunday dinner. Only I knew another conversation existed beneath the one everyone could hear. I waited, patiently. Then I asked my first question. Richard. He looked up from his plate. Yes. I've been thinking more about retirement lately. His fork paused in midair. What about it? I realized we've never really talked about what happens to everything after we're gone. Silence settled over the table, only for a second. Then Richard smiled. We've discussed it plenty. Emily looked surprised. We have? Richard glanced toward her. Not in detail. I've handled most of it. Michael nodded almost automatically. Dad's always been good at planning. I noticed Emily looking from one face to another. Actually, she said, I don't think I've ever heard either of you talk about your estate. Richard laughed softly. That's because it's boring. I smiled. I don't know. I've started thinking maybe I should understand more. Richard's smile became noticeably tighter. We've already taken care of nearly everything. The wording caught my attention. Not. I've taken care of it. Not. We'll review it together. Instead, we've already taken care of nearly everything. Past tense, finished. I picked up my glass of iced tea. What exactly does everything mean? Richard answered quickly. Just normal retirement planning. Michael added, asset protection. Another vague phrase. I tilted my head slightly. Protection from what? Neither of them answered immediately. Finally, Richard spoke. You never know what life brings. Lawsuits, medical expenses, nursing care. Emily nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Then she looked at me. But Mom should know what you've planned too. I kept my expression neutral. That's what I was wondering. Richard smiled again. We'll go over everything soon. I had heard those words before. Soon. Later. Don't worry, trust me. Always later. Never now. I decided to ask another harmless question. Michael. He looked up. Yes, Mom. You've been spending a lot of time helping your father lately. He shrugged. Just giving him another opinion. On retirement planning. Among other things. What other things? His smile faded for the briefest moment. Oh. You know. Business. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds. But I noticed it. So did Emily. She frowned slightly. I didn't know Dad was involved in your business. Richard answered before Michael could. I'm not. I simply enjoy hearing about his projects. Emily laughed. That's funny. All three of us looked at her. Why? She set down her fork. Because Michael told me last month that Dad had been reviewing one of his financing proposals. The room became completely still. Michael looked at Richard. Richard looked at his plate. For just an instant, neither of them spoke. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. Only informally. Richard nodded. Nothing important. Emily didn't seem convinced. I just thought it was interesting. No one replied. Inside, I felt something shift. Small, but important. For the first time, their stories hadn't matched. The silence lingered long enough that I finally changed the subject. So, has anyone spoken to Harold recently? Richard answered immediately. Not since golf. Michael looked genuinely puzzled. I haven't seen him in months. That answer surprised me. Harold had specifically told me Michael attended one of the trust discussions. Months, not years. Michael was pretending they barely interacted. I carefully watched his face. No hesitation, no nervousness. If he was lying, he'd become very comfortable doing it. Dinner continued. Conversation moved toward birthdays and holiday plans. The grandchildren. Emily's upcoming vacation. Yet beneath every ordinary sense, I found myself comparing words against everything Victoria and Harold had told me. Who answered first? Who interrupted? Who looked at whom before speaking? Patterns began appearing. Whenever finances came up, Michael almost always glanced toward Richard before answering. Whenever Emily asked an unexpected question, Richard redirected the conversation within seconds. Neither behavior seemed obvious, until I started looking for it. After dessert, Emily helped me wash dishes, while Richard and Michael carried coffee onto the back patio. As soon as the kitchen door closed, Emily lowered her voice. Mom. I looked at her. Something feels strange. I continued rinsing plates. What do you mean? She hesitated. I don't know. Dad and Michael have been acting. She searched for the right word. Careful. I turned toward her. Careful. They answer questions before anyone finishes asking. They keep looking at each other. And every time finances come up, they suddenly change the subject. I said nothing. Emily sighed. Am I imagining it? Part of me wanted to tell her everything. The trust, Victoria, Harold, the county records, every secret. Instead, I gently placed another plate into the drying rack. I think you've noticed something important. She studied my face. You know something. It wasn't a question. I looked down at the sink. There are some things I'm still trying to understand. Emily stepped closer. Does this have anything to do with those papers Dad asked you to sign? I froze. She noticed. She smiled sadly. I saw them on the breakfast table. Dad looked disappointed after you walked away. I didn't ask because I assumed it was private. She touched my hand. But if you're worried, you don't have to protect me. My eyes filled with tears. For weeks I'd been carrying this burden alone. Standing beside my daughter, I suddenly realized how exhausted I had become. I promise, I whispered. When I know enough, I'll tell you everything. Emily hugged me tightly. I'll be here. No matter what. When everyone finally left that evening, the house felt strangely empty. Richard locked the front door and smiled. That was a nice dinner. It was. You've seemed happier lately. I looked at him carefully. Happier. More relaxed. The irony almost made me laugh. I've been thinking a lot. He nodded. About retirement. Among other things. He smiled warmly. I've always told you not to worry. I'll take care of everything. For 41 years, those words had brought me comfort. Now they sounded like a warning. After Richard went upstairs, I opened my notebook once again. Under today's date, I wrote only one sentence. Emily has started asking questions. Then beneath it, another. Richard and Michael no longer realize they're contradicting each other. Victoria had been right. I hadn't needed to accuse anyone. All I had needed to do was listen. And little by little, the carefully constructed story they had built together was beginning to crack. The Monday after our family dinner, Richard surprised me again. He was already dressed for the day when I came downstairs, his briefcase resting beside the front door and a fresh pot of coffee waiting on the counter. I was hoping we could stop by an attorney's office this Thursday, he said casually, as he poured coffee into my favorite mug. I kept my expression calm. Oh, just to finish those retirement papers. There it was. Not a question. A plan. I accepted the mug with both hands so he wouldn't notice the slight tremor in my fingers. I thought there wasn't any hurry. Richard smiled. There really isn't. He took a sip of coffee before continuing. But since the documents are already prepared, we might as well get them signed. Already prepared. Again, the language caught my attention. Prepared. Waiting. Finished. Everything except my signature. I looked out the kitchen window before answering. Thursday should be fine. The words left my mouth so smoothly that even I almost believed them. Richard visibly relaxed. Perfect. I'll make the appointment. For the first time since this nightmare began, I deliberately gave him exactly what he wanted. Not my signature, only my agreement to appear. As soon as Richard left for work, I called Victoria. He scheduled the signing. When Thursday. She was silent for a moment. Good. I almost laughed. Good. I know that sounds strange. It means we finally know his timetable. He believes you're ready. And that gives us an opportunity. I drove to her office carrying my now familiar canvas, tote filled with copies of every document we had collected. The evidence had grown considerably over the past several weeks. County records, bank statements, Harold's handwritten notes, photographs of missing file folders, property histories. Every page represented another piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Victoria spread everything across the conference table. I've been reviewing the trust agreement again. She tapped one section with her pen. I think we've overlooked something. I leaned forward. What is it? The trust cannot legally become fully operational without your notarized signature. I thought Richard was already acting as trustee. He is. But acting as trustee and completing the trust are different. She reached for another document. Look here. The paragraph explained that the transfer of jointly owned marital property required both spouses to execute the trust agreement unless another valid legal authority existed. Victoria looked at me. That means your signature isn't a formality. It's essential. I frowned. Then why transfer the lake cabin already? That's exactly the question. She paused. My best guess. He believed everything else could be completed afterward. But without your signature. She closed the folder. The structure remains vulnerable. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this ordeal began. Hope. Not because the problem had disappeared, but because Richard's plan wasn't finished. There was still time. Victoria continued. I'd like you to attend Thursday's meeting. I stared at her. Really? Yes. But you are not signing anything. They probably will. What if Richard becomes angry? She smiled gently. Then we learn something valuable. I wasn't sure I shared her confidence. How should I act? Exactly as you have been. Cautious. Interested. Cooperative. But never rushed. She handed me a legal pad. I want you to prepare questions. What kind of questions? the kind an ordinary spouse would naturally ask. So began listing examples. Why is this trust necessary? Why am I no longer listed as co-owner? What happens if Richard dies first? Why is Michael the successor trustee? Can Emily review these documents? Each question seemed simple, reasonable. None sounded like an accusation. Victoria smiled. People expecting blind agreement often become uncomfortable when someone simply asks for explanations. The next 2 days passed slowly. Richard seemed happier than he had in months. He whistled while shaving, suggested we take a vacation after all the paperwork is finished. Even joked that we'd finally be able to stop thinking about legal documents. I wondered whether he truly believed that, or whether he simply wanted me to believe it. Wednesday afternoon, Michael unexpectedly stopped by again. This time he found me watering flowers in the front yard. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." I took the watering can from my hands. "I've got this." For several minutes we worked side by side without speaking. Finally he asked, "Dad said you're meeting with the attorney tomorrow." I looked at him carefully. "So he told you?" Michael shrugged. "He mentioned it. I hope everything goes smoothly." There was that word again. Smoothly. Almost everyone involved seemed more concerned with completing the process than explaining it. "I've been reading more," I said casually. Michael smiled. "Mom, you don't have to understand every legal detail." I slowly turned toward him. "Why not?" He looked surprised. "Because that's what attorneys are for." "And your father?" I held his gaze. "I spent 38 years teaching children to ask questions before making important decisions. Why should retirement be different?" For the first time, Michael looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I didn't mean—" "I know." I softened my voice. "I'm simply trying to understand." He nodded. "That's fair." Then after a brief hesitation he added, "Dad's only trying to protect you." The sentence sounded rehearsed, not heartfelt, as though he'd repeated it enough times that it no longer belonged to him. I smiled faintly. "I hope you're right." He looked relieved. Before leaving, he hugged me. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too." As I watched him drive away, tears filled my eyes. I never doubted that he loved me. That was what made everything so painful. Love and betrayal were somehow existing inside the same person. Thursday morning arrived gray and unusually cool for early autumn. Richard wore his navy suit, the one he reserved for weddings, funerals, and important business meetings. "You look nice," I said. He smiled. "So do you." I had chosen a simple cream-colored blouse and dark slacks. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested I was walking into what might become the most important legal meeting of my life. The drive to the attorney's office lasted almost 30 minutes. Richard chatted comfortably about traffic, the weather, and an upcoming church fundraiser. Not once did he mention the documents waiting inside, as though the entire purpose of the trip had become almost insignificant. That more than anything unsettled me. When we arrived, a receptionist greeted us warmly. "Mr. and Mrs. Gomez." Richard smiled. "That's us. We're ready for you." Inside the conference room sat a middle-aged attorney I had never met. Beside him was a notary public arranging several folders. Everything had already been prepared. Tabs marked signature lines. Pens rested neatly beside each document. Richard pulled out my chair. "See? This won't take long." I smiled politely. "I'm sure it won't." The attorney began explaining the trust in broad, reassuring language. Asset protection, estate efficiency, tax planning, generational security. It sounded almost identical to Richard's explanations. Then the attorney slid the first signature page toward me. "If you'll sign here, Mrs. Gomez." I picked up the pen, then set it back down. "I have a few questions first." The room became very quiet. Richard's smile remained on his face, but only barely. I turned toward the attorney. "Before I sign, I'd like to understand exactly why my name disappears as co-owner on several of these assets." The attorney glanced briefly at Richard. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. So did Richard. And in that tiny exchange of eye contact, I realized something important. Neither of them had expected me to ask a single question. The attorney's eyes shifted toward Richard for less than a second. It was such a small movement that most people would have missed it. I didn't. Neither did Richard. He answered before the attorney could. Scarlett, you're worrying over technical language. His tone remained gentle, almost amused, the same tone he used whenever one of our grandchildren became nervous about thunderstorms. It doesn't change anything about our marriage. I smiled politely. I hope you're right. Then I turned back to the attorney. I'd still like an answer. The attorney cleared his throat. Mrs. Gomez, under the trust structure, legal title transfers to the trust itself. That arrangement allows the trustee to administer the assets efficiently. And who is the trustee? You husband. And after Richard? The attorney glanced at another page. Your son, Michael. I nodded slowly. So if Richard died before me, Michael, not I, would control the trust. The room became quiet again. Technically, yes. I looked directly at Richard. You never mentioned that. He reached across the table and gently touched my hand. I didn't think the details mattered. The words hurt more than I expected. The details. 41 years together, and apparently, my future had become a detail. I withdrew my hand without making the movement obvious. I think they matter. The attorney attempted to redirect the conversation. These arrangements are not uncommon. I understand. I kept my voice calm. But I'd still like to understand every page before signing. Richard laughed softly. You've always been thorough. His smile remained pleasant, but I recognized something new in his eyes. Impatience. The attorney turned several pages. We can certainly review each section. Wonderful, I replied. I've highlighted a few questions. I opened my notebook, exactly as Victoria had instructed. Question 1. Why was I never included in the meetings where this trust was created? Silence. Richard answered first. I didn't want to overwhelm you. I was recovering. I looked at him. My cancer treatments ended 7 years ago. He blinked. I know. I just meant, you've been happier without financial stress. Another carefully chosen sentence, one that sounded loving on the surface. I simply wrote something in my notebook. Richard noticed. What are you writing, my notes? He smiled again. No need for notes. I'll explain everything. I'd rather write it down. The attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Question 2. Why wasn't Emily included in these discussions? Richard sighed. She isn't interested in finances. I frowned. Did you ask her? No. Then how do you know? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the attorney again. That tiny glance happened for the third time. The attorney finally spoke. The trust itself doesn't require every beneficiary to participate. I didn't ask what the trust required. I kept my voice remarkably steady. I asked why my daughter wasn't informed. No one answered. Another note went into my notebook. Question 3. What happens if I disagree with a future financial decision? The attorney folded his hands. As beneficiary, you could certainly express your concerns. But could I stop the trustee? He hesitated. Generally. No. I nodded once. So if the trustee wanted to sell our home, he would have authority under certain circumstances. And if I wanted to stay, another pause, the trust document would control. Richard leaned closer. Scarlett, that would never happen. I looked directly at him. But legally, it could. He didn't respond. Instead, he gave a small smile that looked more practiced than genuine. I closed the notebook. I appreciate everyone's patience. Then I asked the question Victoria believed mattered most. May I take these documents home for another week? Richard answered immediately. They've already been reviewed. I know. I'd still like more time. The attorney looked uncertain. There isn't any legal reason you couldn't. Richard's jaw tightened ever so slightly. I thought we agreed we'd finish today. I agreed to come. I didn't agree to sign. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not anger. Not yet. Disappointment. Calculated disappointment. Scarlett, you trust me, don't you? There it was. The question he believed would end the conversation. 41 years ago, it probably would have. Today, I answered differently. I trust people more when they answer my questions. The attorney quietly removed his reading glasses. Even he seemed to realize the meeting had shifted. Richard tried another approach. This is about protecting you. I appreciate that. But protection shouldn't require secrecy. Again. Silence. Finally, the attorney pushed the documents back into their folders. There doesn't appear to be any urgency. We can certainly reschedule. I noticed Richard's shoulders stiffen. There actually is a tax deadline. The attorney looked surprised. There is. Richard hesitated. Well, I mean, I'd prefer to complete everything this quarter. Another contradiction. Victoria had been right. Pressure reveals cracks. The attorney looked puzzled. The projected tax advantages wouldn't disappear immediately. Richard forced a laugh. Perhaps I misunderstood. I pretended not to notice. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. No signatures. No confrontation. No accusations. Only unanswered questions. Yet somehow I felt we had accomplished far more than signing ever could have. The drive home was almost completely silent. Richard kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't comment on traffic, didn't mention lunch. Halfway home, he finally spoke. You embarrassed me. His voice wasn't loud. That somehow made it worse. I looked out the passenger window. I asked questions. You questioned me in front of an attorney. I questioned legal documents. He sighed heavily. I've spent my entire career helping people prepare for retirement. I know. And now my own wife acts as though I'm trying to deceive her. The sentence hung in the air. I slowly turned toward him. Are you? For the first time since all of this began. Richard didn't answer immediately. The silence lasted nearly 10 seconds. Finally, he shook his head. No. I just wish you'd believe me. I nodded. I wish I could. Neither of us spoke again until we reached home. That afternoon, I drove directly to Victoria's office. She listened carefully while I described every question, every answer, every glance exchanged across the conference table. When I finished, she smiled. You did exactly what I hoped. I didn't sign. No. You gathered information. She pulled out a yellow legal pad. Let's review. She began writing. Richard claimed urgency. Attorney said there was none. Richard claimed tax deadline. Attorney appeared surprised. Richard admitted misunderstanding. She underlined the final sentence. That's important. Why? Because someone wasn't telling the truth. She paused. Possibly more than one person. Then she reached into a file drawer and removed another folder. I've been waiting until after today's meeting to show you this. She handed me several certified county records. What are these? Everything recorded under the Gomez Family Legacy Trust. I slowly turned the pages, then I stopped. One property, then another, the lake cabin. A small, undeveloped parcel Richard had inherited from his father. Several investment accounts referenced by number. Each document carried recording dates. Each listed Richard as trustee. Near the bottom of the final page, one entry immediately caught my eye. Future assignment pending. Execution awaiting final signature. Victoria quietly watched my expression. Do you see it? I nodded. My signature. Yes. She leaned forward. Scarlett. If you had signed today, she tapped the final line. I believe every remaining transfer would have become effective within days. I looked back at the papers. The realization hit me with full force. This morning, Richard hadn't simply hoped I would sign. He had expected that one signature to trigger the final stage of a plan that had been quietly unfolding for almost a year. And now, because I had asked a few simple questions, that carefully constructed plan had stalled just inches from completion. I drove home from Victoria's office with the certified county records resting on the passenger seat beside me. For weeks, I had been chasing suspicions. Now I was carrying evidence. Not enough to accuse anyone in court. Not yet. But enough to prove that my instincts had not betrayed me. Victoria had asked me to do one more thing before our next meeting. Go home, she had said. Don't confront Richard. Don't change your routine. And think carefully about every major date connected to your health over the last several years. I remembered looking at her in confusion. My health? She nodded. Sometimes the smallest inconsistency becomes the biggest piece of evidence. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. By the following afternoon, I did. My sewing room had always been the place where I stored things that mattered too much to throw away: family scrapbooks, birthday cards, old report cards from my teaching years, hospital folders from my cancer treatment. I hadn't opened most of those boxes in years. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight as I carried the first storage bin onto the floor. The label simply read, "Medical Records." I opened it slowly. Every appointment had been carefully organized: biopsy reports, surgical records, chemotherapy schedules, insurance explanations, medication lists. Even after all these years, seeing those papers again tightened something inside my chest. Cancer changes the way people remember time. Most people measure years by birthdays or holidays. I still remembered mine by surgeries. The first operation, the final chemotherapy treatment, the day my doctor finally said the word remission. I sat cross-legged on the floor for nearly 2 hours reading through records I hoped I would never need again. Then I found a calendar. Not a medical calendar. My own. Every appointment had been written in blue ink. Every hospital visit. Every follow-up examination. Every blood test. Teachers become professional record keepers. Apparently retirement hadn't changed me. I smiled sadly at the thought. Then one date stopped me. October 14th. The page contained only 4 words. Hospital. Overnight observation. I frowned. Why did that date feel familiar? I reached into my tote and removed another folder Victoria had copied from the trust records. One property transfer immediately caught my attention. Recorded October 14. My heartbeat quickened. That couldn't be right. I spread both documents across the floor. The county filing, my personal calendar, the same date. Exactly, I whispered aloud. I wasn't home. Not only wasn't I home, I had been admitted to Williamson Medical Center after complications from a follow-up procedure. I remembered it clearly now. A mild internal infection. Unexpected. Doctors kept me overnight for observation. Richard never left the hospital. Or at least, that's how I remembered it. I searched through the hospital paperwork until I found the admission records. Admission 9:12 a.m. Discharge October 15, 11:37 a.m. For more than 26 hours I had never left the hospital. Neither had Richard. He had stayed in the room with me almost the entire time. Or had he? A memory surfaced. Late that afternoon, Richard had disappeared for nearly 2 hours. He told me he was meeting with the insurance company downstairs because my cell phone reception inside the hospital was poor. I had believed him. Why wouldn't I now? I wasn't so sure. The following morning I hurried to Victoria's office. She looked up immediately as I placed the calendar beside the certified filing. I think I found something. She adjusted her glasses. What is it? The lake property transfer. She compared both documents. Then her expression changed. October 14th. I nodded. I was hospitalized. Victoria immediately reached for the admission records. Several minutes passed while she read every page. Finally, she leaned back. This is significant. Why? She turned the county filing toward me. Look at the acknowledgement. I hadn't paid attention to that section before. It listed the execution date. October 14. Then another line. Supporting documentation reviewed and affirmed. I don't understand. Victoria spoke carefully. If supporting documents required your review that day, she tapped my hospital records. You were physically incapable of reviewing anything outside the hospital. I certainly wasn't visiting attorneys. Exactly. She reached for another certified document. I requested the recording packet yesterday. I hadn't expected it to arrive this quickly. Inside the packet was another page I had never seen. An affidavit referencing marital acknowledgement. No signature, no initials, no witness from my side, only Richard's. Victoria's eyes narrowed. That's interesting. Is it illegal? I'm not ready to say that. But it certainly raises questions. She photocopied every page. Then she reached for the telephone. I need additional certified records. From where? The title company. And possibly the notary. She looked thoughtful. If someone claims documents were properly executed, we need to know exactly who witnessed them. Later that afternoon, Victoria called me back into her office. I received another response. She handed me a notarized acknowledgement. My stomach tightened immediately. The document contained Richard's signature, the notary's signature, the official seal. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, except one line: spouse acknowledged understanding of transfer. I stared at the sentence. I never acknowledged anything. I know. Victoria looked equally troubled. Notice something else. She pointed to the notary commission information. This notary's office is in Nashville. So, you were admitted to a hospital in Franklin, nearly 30 miles away. I slowly understood. If Richard met the notary in Nashville, he could not have been sitting beside you in the hospital at the same time. Exactly. The realization settled over both of us. Either my memory was completely wrong, or someone had represented events in a way that simply couldn't be true. Victoria leaned back quietly. I think we found the first timeline that cannot be reconciled. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the hospital. Every detail returned with surprising clarity. Emily had visited after work carrying flowers. Michael came briefly before driving back to Nashville. Richard ordered soup from the hospital cafeteria because I couldn't eat much. A nurse named Angela checked my temperature every 4 hours. The memories felt vivid, specific, real. I opened another storage box. Inside was an old envelope containing hospital visitor passes. Without much hope, I looked through them. Most had faded. One still remained readable. Visitor Richard Gomez, time issued 8:55 a.m. No exit time. Another pass. Visitor Emily Carter, 5:41 p.m. Then I remembered something else. Hospitals had security cameras, visitor logs, parking records, maybe even electronic badge access. I immediately called Victoria. When she answered, I barely let her speak. The hospital. What about it? They may still have visitor records. She became silent for several seconds. Finally, she said, I don't know how much they've retained after all these years. But if any records still exist, they could become extremely important. The next morning, Victoria called again. Her voice sounded different, excited. I've been thinking all night. So have I. I believe we've been asking the wrong question. What do you mean? We've been asking whether Richard transferred property improperly. She paused. I think we should be asking something else. What? She spoke slowly. How many documents rely on October 14th? I immediately understood. If one filing depended upon an impossible timeline, perhaps others did too. By lunchtime, Victoria had assembled every trust-related filing in chronological order across her conference table. Colored tabs marked each document. October 14th appeared once, then again, and again. 3 separate filings, 2 acknowledgments, 1 supporting affidavit, all connected to the same 26 hours I had spent in a hospital bed. Victoria looked directly at me. Scarlett, if these documents truly depend upon events that could not have happened. She paused before finishing. We may no longer be looking at simple estate planning. I already knew the word neither of us wanted to say aloud. Fraud. Neither of us spoke it. Not yet. But for the first time since Richard placed those papers beside my breakfast plate, I realized this story might no longer end with an argument inside a marriage. It might end inside a courtroom. The probate courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. After weeks of gathering records, reviewing timelines, and replaying painful conversations in my mind, I had somehow expected a grand courtroom with polished wood rows of spectators and dramatic speeches. Instead, it was quiet, orderly, almost ordinary. Sunlight filtered through tall windows onto rows of wooden benches where only a handful of people sat waiting for unrelated hearings. A clerk organized files at the front of the room while attorneys quietly reviewed notes with their clients. There was nothing dramatic about it. Yet I knew that before the day ended, 41 years of my marriage would be examined one document at a time. Victoria sat beside me. She wore a navy suit and carried 3 thick binders organized with colored tabs. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I smiled weakly. "If I said terrified, would that surprise you?" "Not at all." She gently closed one of the binders. "But remember something. This hearing isn't about proving whether Richard loved you. It's about proving whether the law was followed." I nodded. That distinction mattered. Love and legality were no longer the same conversation. Across the aisle, Richard entered with his attorney. For the first time in weeks, he looked every bit of his 66 years. His shoulders seemed lower, his confident stride had disappeared. When our eyes met, neither of us looked away. He gave me a small nod. I returned it. Not because everything was forgiven, because after 4 decades together, simple courtesy was the only thing we still shared. A few moments later, Michael arrived. He looked exhausted. His usually perfect suit was slightly wrinkled and dark circles rested beneath his eyes. When he noticed me, he started walking in my direction. Then he stopped. His attorney quietly placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him back. Emily slipped onto the bench beside me. Without saying a word, she reached for my hand. I squeezed hers tightly. That simple gesture reminded me I wasn't facing this alone. The courtroom deputy called our case. Estate matter of Gomez Family Legacy Trust. Judge Patricia Munro entered. Everyone stood. She carried herself with calm authority rather than intimidation. After reviewing the filings for several minutes, she looked over her glasses. "This hearing concerns the validity of several trust-related transfers and associated property filings." She turned toward Victoria. "Counsel, you may proceed." Victoria stood. Her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, this case is not based upon assumptions. It is based upon timelines." She walked toward the evidence table, specifically timelines that cannot coexist. She opened the first binder. "We begin with October 14th. The courtroom monitor displayed my hospital admission record. Mrs. Scarlett Gomez was admitted to Williamson Medical Center at 9:12 a.m. Another document appeared. County property filing, same date. Then another, trust acknowledgement, same date. Victoria spoke carefully. "The trust-related filings imply that Mrs. Gomez reviewed and acknowledged supporting documentation connected with these transfers." She paused. "However, she displayed my medical records beside the county filings. The medical records establish that Mrs. Gomez remained hospitalized during the relevant period." Richard's attorney immediately stood. "Objection. Counsel is drawing conclusions." Judge Monroe nodded. "Sustained as to conclusions. Proceed with facts." Victoria smiled politely. "Of course, Your Honor." She displayed another exhibit. Hospital nursing logs, medication administration records, visitor records. Then another. Appointment logs from the attorney's office. October 14th. Attendees: Richard Gomez. Michael Gomez. No Scarlett Gomez. Victoria allowed the silence to settle. Finally, she spoke. "The law office's own appointment records indicate Mrs. Gomez was not present." The judge leaned forward slightly. Richard's attorney rose again. "The documents never specifically state Mrs. Gomez attended that meeting." Victoria nodded. "Correct. They instead state she acknowledged the supporting documentation." She picked up another certified record. "My question is simple. When?" No one answered. Victoria continued. "If Mrs. Gomez remained hospitalized, if she was absent from the attorney meeting, if she did not review the documentation, when did the acknowledgement occur?" The courtroom remained completely silent. Judge Monroe made several notes. Then Richard's attorney stood. "Your Honor, the filings contain administrative language. This does not establish fraudulent intent." Victoria didn't argue. Instead, she simply said, "Then let's continue." She opened the second binder. "Mr. George Lawson." Harold slowly walked to the witness stand. After taking the oath, he settled into the chair. Victoria approached. "Mr. Lawson, what was your profession?" "Certified public accountant." For how long? 36 years. Did Richard Gomez seek your professional advice regarding a family trust? Yes. When? Approximately 11 months before these proceedings. Victoria displayed Harold's handwritten meeting notes. Are these your notes? They are. Made on the day of the meeting. Yes. Were they kept in the ordinary course of your professional practice? Yes. Victoria nodded. What concerns did Mr. Gomez discuss? Harold answered calmly. He wanted to place nearly all marital assets into an irrevocable trust. Did he indicate whether Scarlett Gomez would participate in planning? He said she didn't need to. What advice did you give? I advised him to involve his wife in every discussion. Did he agree? No. What did he say? Harold looked briefly toward Richard before answering. He said, Scarlett trusts me completely. The words echoed through the courtroom. Victoria asked one final question. Did Michael Gomez participate in later discussions? Yes. In what capacity? He discussed successor trustee authority and long-term control of the trust. Michael lowered his eyes. Victoria thanked Harold. Next came another witness, a representative from the original law office. Victoria approached carefully. Did your office prepare the trust? Yes. What information did you rely upon? The information provided by Mr. Gomez. Were you informed that Mrs. Gomez preferred not to attend meetings? Yes. Were you informed that she understood the trust structure? Yes. The representative looked uncomfortable. We now understand those representations may have been incomplete. Richard's attorney attempted to minimize the testimony. The law office acted in good faith. We agree, Victoria replied. Our concern has never been the law office. Our concern is the information supplied to it. Judge Monroe nodded thoughtfully. Victoria opened her final binder. This exhibit contains certified county filings. She highlighted 3 separate property transfers. The recording dates reference supporting documentation inconsistent with the established timeline. Then she displayed another chart. Every filing, every meeting, every hospital record, every email, side by side. For the first time, the entire sequence became visible. Months of planning, incremental transfers, repeated references to Scarlett's supposed understanding. No evidence she had actually participated. Judge Monroe studied the timeline carefully. Richard's attorney stood for redirect. He argued that Richard genuinely believed he was protecting marital assets. That administrative language should not automatically invalidate every filing. That no property had yet been sold. That Scarlett had suffered no financial loss because the trust remained incomplete. Victoria waited until he finished. Then she quietly walked back to the podium. Your Honor, this case is not about whether assets were eventually sold. It's about whether informed consent existed. She lifted the unsigned signature page. The one document Richard Gomez never obtained. She held it where everyone could see. Mrs. Gomez's signature. If she truly understood everything, why was this signature still missing? No one answered. Victoria slowly placed the page back into the binder. Because when Mrs. Gomez finally read the fine print, she stopped trusting words and started asking questions. Judge Monroe looked toward Richard. Mr. Gomez, you will have the opportunity to testify. Richard slowly stood. For several long seconds, he simply looked at me. Then he spoke. I never intended to hurt my wife. His voice cracked. I thought I was protecting everything we'd built. Judge Monroe interrupted gently. That is not my question. She leaned forward. My question is much simpler. When your wife repeatedly asked to participate, why didn't you simply tell her the truth? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, he had no explanation left. The courtroom remained silent long after Judge Patricia Monroe asked her question. Why didn't you simply tell your wife the truth? Richard stood at the witness table with both hands resting on the wooden rail in front of him. For a man who had spent 4 decades advising clients through complicated financial decisions, he suddenly seemed unable to organize a single sentence. He looked toward me, then toward Michael. Finally, he lowered his eyes. I thought, he began quietly. I thought I was doing what was best. Judge Monroe waited. Best for whom? She asked. Richard swallowed. Our family. Victoria remained seated. She didn't interrupt. She didn't object. She simply allowed Richard to continue speaking. Sometimes silence is more powerful than cross-examination. Richard took a long breath. When Scarlett became ill several years ago, I became terrified. His voice trembled for the first time. I handled every medical bill, every insurance claim. I watched how quickly everything we built could disappear. He paused. I promised myself that if anything like that ever happened again, our assets would be protected. I listened carefully. Part of me believed him. Not all of it, but part. Fear had probably started this story. Control had finished it. Judge Monroe nodded slightly. No one questions your desire to protect marital assets. Her expression remained calm. The issue before this court is whether protection justified excluding your wife from decisions affecting her own property. Richard had no answer. Michael slowly stood. Your Honor. His attorney looked surprised. I'd like permission to speak. After a brief discussion, Judge Monroe allowed him to address the court. Michael walked several steps forward before stopping. He didn't look at the judge, he looked at me. I'm sorry. The words were barely louder than a whisper. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to hear me say it. My heart ached, not because the apology erased what had happened, because it sounded genuine. I believe Dad, Michael continued. He told me the trust was only a better way to organize everything. He said you'd already agreed. He shook his head. I never saw you sign. I never asked why. I should have. Victoria quietly wrote something in her notebook. Richard slowly turned toward his son. Michael. Michael interrupted him. No, Dad. I have to say this. He faced the judge. When Mr. Lawson questioned whether Mom had reviewed the trust, I should have insisted she attend every meeting. I didn't. I thought I was helping. He closed his eyes briefly. I was wrong. Emily began crying quietly beside me. I reached over and held her hand. Judge Monroe listened carefully before speaking again. The honesty shown today is appreciated. But honesty after discovery does not erase earlier actions. She reviewed several pages of notes before announcing a short recess. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt strangely quiet. People passed by discussing unrelated cases. Children laughed near the elevators. Life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Richard approached slowly. His attorney remained several steps behind. Scarlett. I turned. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally he said, I never wanted us to end up here. I know. I loved you. I looked at him carefully. I believe you did. The tears filling his eyes surprised me. I still do, I answered honestly. Love isn't what brought us here. He frowned. Then what did? You stopped trusting me with my own life. He closed his eyes. I thought I was protecting you. You decided for me. I know. You convinced attorneys. You convinced Michael. You convinced yourself. But you never once asked what I wanted. Richard slowly nodded. I see that now. I wanted to feel anger. Instead, I felt overwhelming sadness. The man standing in front of me wasn't a monster. He was simply a husband who had gradually convinced himself that control and love meant the same thing. They didn't. The hearing resumed 20 minutes later. Judge Monroe returned with a written ruling. Every person inside the courtroom stood as she began reading. After reviewing the testimony, documentary evidence, and certified public records, this court finds multiple procedural deficiencies affecting the validity of the Gomez Family Legacy Trust. She continued carefully. Mrs. Scarlett Gomez did not provide informed consent to the trust structure. Several property transfers relied upon documentation containing material inconsistencies. The court therefore declares the current trust unenforceable. I closed my eyes. Not from celebration, from relief. Judge Monroe continued. All contested transfers dependent upon the incomplete trust are hereby set aside pending proper title restoration. In addition, she looked directly toward Richard. The court recommends that corrected property records be filed immediately. She then turned toward both attorneys. Any remaining civil issues concerning document preparation or related representations may proceed separately if the parties choose. The courtroom deputy handed copies of the ruling to each attorney. Victoria quietly squeezed my shoulder. It's over. I looked down at the written decision. For weeks I had imagined this moment. I expected triumph. Instead, I mostly felt tired, very tired. Outside the courthouse, reporters were nowhere to be found. There were no cameras, no dramatic headlines, only autumn wind moving through the trees surrounding the courthouse lawn. Michael approached first. Without saying anything, he handed me a small envelope. I wrote this last night. I wasn't sure I'd have the courage to say everything. You don't have to read it now. I accepted it. Thank you. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He hugged me, not quickly, not awkwardly. Like a little boy who suddenly realized he had wandered much farther from home than he intended. I'm sorry, Mom. I know. I really am. I know. When he stepped away, Richard remained standing several yards behind him. He looked older than he had only a month earlier. Finally, he walked toward me. I'll cooperate with every correction. I hope you do. I don't want to fight anymore. I believed him. Whether because of regret exhaustion or finally seeing the consequences of his decisions, I couldn't say. But I believed him. I've decided something, I told him quietly. What? I'm moving out. His face fell. For how long? I don't know. I need space. I need to remember who I am when every decision isn't made by someone else. He nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not leaving because I hate you. I know. I'm leaving because I need peace. His voice broke. I should have given you that from the beginning. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. Over the following 2 weeks, every property transfer identified in the court's ruling was reversed. Corrected deeds were recorded. The lake cabin returned to joint ownership. The undeveloped parcel inherited from Richard's father was restored. The trust itself became little more than a stack of incomplete paperwork stored in legal archives. Richard voluntarily resigned from every trustee position connected with the disputed filings. Michael withdrew from all successor appointments. Neither action erased what had happened, but they mattered. Actions always mattered more than apologies. As for me, I rented a small cottage only 15 minutes from our family home. It wasn't large, it didn't need to be. For the first time in decades, every document inside that house belonged to me. Every key fit a lock I controlled. Every decision was mine to make. One evening, while unpacking the final box, I found the unsigned trust document Richard had placed beside my breakfast all those months ago. I stared at the blank signature line for a long time. Then I smiled sadly. One empty line. One unanswered question. One moment when I finally decided to read before signing. That single decision had changed the direction of my entire life, and despite everything I had lost, it had also given me something priceless, my own voice. 6 months passed before I walked into our old house again. Not because the court required it, not because Richard asked me to, because I finally felt ready. Healing, I discovered, doesn't happen the day a judge signs an order. It happens quietly, one ordinary morning at a time. My little cottage had slowly become a home. Every Saturday I opened the windows to let fresh Tennessee air drift through the rooms. I planted lavender beside the front porch. I learned that silence could feel comforting instead of lonely. Most importantly, I learned something I hadn't realized I'd forgotten: how to make decisions without asking anyone else's permission. At 63 years old, that felt strangely new. Every morning I chose my own routine. Some days I read novels with coffee on the porch. Other days I volunteered at the public library. On Wednesdays, I began teaching a free financial literacy workshop at the community center. That idea had come from Victoria. You've spent months learning more about trust deeds, ownership, and legal documents than most people ever will. Use it. The first class attracted only 7 people, mostly widows, one retired couple, a recently divorced woman in her 50s. I stood at the front of the room holding a simple folder. Inside it were blank copies of common financial documents. I am not an attorney, I told them. I'm not here to give legal advice. I'm here to remind you that every signature deserves a question. The room remained completely silent. Then an elderly gentleman raised his hand. My wife always lets me handle everything. I smiled gently. Then when you get home tonight, sit down together. Read the papers together. Neither of you should carry that responsibility alone. By the end of the hour, several people thanked me. One woman hugged me. My husband died 3 years ago. I never knew where anything was. I don't want my daughters to face that someday. As she spoke, I realized something beautiful. The hardest chapter of my life had quietly become useful to someone else. Pain had finally found purpose. Emily visited almost every weekend. Sometimes she brought homemade soup, sometimes flowers, sometimes nothing except herself. One Sunday afternoon, we sat on my porch watching rain fall across the yard. I've missed this, she said. What talking? She laughed softly. We used to talk about everything. I know. I think somewhere along the way, she hesitated. Dad started answering questions before either of us asked them. I nodded. I let him. So did I. She looked down at her coffee. I still love him. I do too. The answer surprised neither of us. Love rarely disappears overnight. Trust can. But love often lingers long after disappointment. Emily sighed. I visit him every week. How is he? Quieter. He sold his golf clubs. I looked surprised. He did. He said they reminded him too much of everything he lost. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Emily asked, Do you think you'll ever move back? I looked across the yard where the lavender swayed gently in the breeze. No, I don't think so. Are you angry? I thought carefully before answering. No, I'm simply different now. Michael waited almost 4 months before asking to see me alone. We met at the same small cafe where Harold had first told me the truth. He looked healthier than he had during the court hearing, still older somehow. Humility has a way of aging people before slowly making them wiser. When I arrived, he stood immediately. Thanks for coming. I smiled. You sounded nervous. I am. For several minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Work, Emily's children, the weather. Finally, he reached into his briefcase. I brought something. He handed me a folder. Inside were resignation letters. He had formally removed himself from every trustee appointment connected with the old trust. I wanted you to see them. I've accepted a different position. What kind? I left commercial development. I looked up in surprise. What are you doing now? Residential housing. For first-time buyers. He smiled sadly. I realized somewhere along the way I stopped helping families build homes. I was only thinking about transactions. His words reminded me so much of Harold. Fair, possible, control, money. Somewhere inside those ideas, Michael had lost sight of people. I'm proud of you, I said quietly. His eyes filled with tears. You are. I am. Because changing direction takes courage. He looked down. I don't expect you to forget. I won't. I don't expect things to go back to normal. They won't. I only hope. His voice cracked. Someday, you'll trust me again. I reached across the table and held his hand. Trust isn't given all at once. It's rebuilt. One honest choice at a time. He nodded slowly. I can do that. I believe you can. Richard and I never divorced. Many people expected us to. Some encouraged it. Others couldn't understand why we chose differently. The truth was much simpler. The marriage we once had no longer existed. But 41 years of shared life couldn't simply be erased by a judge's ruling. We remained legally married, emotionally. We became something else. Two people learning how to speak honestly after decades of assumptions. Richard attended counseling, not because the court required it, because he wanted to understand how fear had slowly become control. Once every month we met for lunch, always in public, always without discussing legal documents. Some lunches were awkward, some peaceful. Gradually we learned something neither of us had practiced for years: listening. One afternoon, nearly a year after everything happened, Richard looked at me across the restaurant table. "I've thought about that breakfast every single day." "So have I." "I keep asking myself one question. What? What if you had signed without reading?" I smiled sadly. "I've wondered the same thing." He lowered his eyes. "I don't think I could have lived with what would have happened." I believed him. Not because it excused anything, because people sometimes don't understand the destination of the road they're building until they finally arrive. A few weeks later, I finished organizing my study. The last item waiting inside an old storage box was the unsigned trust document, the very one Richard had placed beside my pancakes that quiet morning. The signature line remained completely blank. I bought a simple wooden frame, not because I wanted to remember betrayal, because I wanted to remember the moment I chose to ask one more question. Today that frame hangs above the bookshelf in my study. Visitors sometimes ask why I display an unsigned legal document. I always smile before answering, because one sentence changed my life. It reminds me every morning that trust and understanding should always walk together. One without the other is never enough. If my story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this: never feel embarrassed for asking questions. Never believe love requires silence. The people who truly care about you will never be offended by your desire to understand. Sometimes the smallest words, hidden in the finest print, reveal the biggest truths. And sometimes the strongest thing you will ever write isn't your signature. It's your decision not to.